My guest today is Thomas Theiner. A former member of the Italian army, Thomas is a filmmaker and historian. For many years, he lived in Kyiv working for Ukraine's largest filmmaker, and he was there during the 2014 Maidan. We discussed the history of Russia and Ukraine and why Russia is such a terrible place. Okay, let's go.
Conflict, politics, military-industrial complex, technology, war. The Flash Traffic Podcast.
This is a book about a guy that has depression. So we're going to have 400 pages of bleak depression now. Enjoy. And you're like, after 200 pages, you're like...
Yeah, I'm reading the Gulag Archipelago right now and talk about depressive. Just disgusting. Just disgusting state of humanity, I guess, to even... You know, whenever I read or see documentaries about the how terrible humanity is and has been in history, I'm just thinking nothing should surprise us.
Yeah,
you know.
I read the book, and I read it in combination with Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. It was like, okay.
Yeah, Russia's a terrible place. It always has been. It always has been a terrible place. I'm sure there was some moments. I'm not a Russian historian, obviously, but I'm sure there's some moments there with the Tsar, maybe pre-1860, that were pretty nice in Russia, maybe. But, you know, for the most part, what a terrible place. The thing is,
of all the Russian books I read, the worst was The Whisperers.
I have not read that. What is that about? Whisperers.
I think it was Orlando Fix, a British scholar, who wrote basically a book. It's all letters people sent from the gulags under Stalin to basically tell their families to save themselves and forget them. And it's basically like, my dear daughter, yes, your mama is a traitor and will be shot. So please denounce your mama and live a happy life. So it's a whole book of what people sent to the NKVD to denounce their neighbors, what people from the prison sent to try to save their families, what confessions they beat out of them, and basically how people try to survive during the Great Purges under Stalin. And you're reading like it's like... So it's if you know what the Stasi did in East Germany or the Gestapo in Germany, this is like complete different level. And you're just sitting there the whole time you're feeling sick.
Yeah. Some of those guys and women were rounded up during the purges just randomly. I mean, there was some of them, nobody was safe. There was some commissars and their spouses that got rounded up, and they're like, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. You know, you're a member of the party, but your wife is in Siberia right now. I mean, it was just some of it was just so random, thoughtless. What a ridiculous thing, you know.
Just check, the book's name is The Whisperers: Private Life in Stalin's Russia, and it's one of the 2 worst books I ever read. So if someone wants to feel lucky to not live in those times, the one book is to read The Whisperers, The Private Life in Russia under Stalin, and the other one is Ordinary Man, about German police officers who were told, well, you can regulate the traffic here, or you can go to Ukraine and start shooting women and children who are Jewish. Would you like to do it? And they got 1,000 volunteers, and the book is basically these guys going and telling, well, we couldn't shoot the babies, so we had to bayonet them. And it's a horrific book.
Jesus. That's terrible.
The thing is, these police battalions shot 1 million people.
That's amazing. How do you even physically do that? How is that possible?
The book goes through very detailed how the bullets arrived, how they got the vodka, the alcohol to basically get them through the job. The book's title is Ordinary Man, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution, from Christopher Browning. So Yeah, it's kind of the books that nobody wants to read because they're like showing you the worst of humanity in kind of dictatorships and in genocide. But if you read them, you understand the world so much better because it's like, so the guy is like, a son is born for me, so we have tonight a celebration. But first, let's shoot 600 women and children. Then he writes his wife a letter. So we should name him like that. And by the way, from the dead bodies of the children, I took all these clothes and sending them to you now, so our child has some clothes. Jesus. And you're like,
yeah,
police officers, so the people that should uphold the law.
It's important to read these things and to realize that as much as things change as far as technology and, we move into the Jetson age or whatever, but human nature doesn't change. And they're doing the same things in Ukraine, right? The Russians are doing the same things in Ukraine that the Stasi, that, just name your terrible humans throughout history, the Genghis Khan, the Mongols, these things never change. This is human nature. This is war. And when you let slip the dogs of war like the Russians have, very, very bad things happen. Very, very bad things.
The problem today is that almost no one remembers these things, or the younger generation has no clue what happened here. But if you read these books and then you read about how the Russians arrived in southern Ukraine and there were demonstrations against the Russians, and then all the demonstrations stopped suddenly because people were just suddenly happy to be under Russian occupation. If you read this Whisperers book, you understand what is happening there. The denouncing, the disappearances, the murder of the very, very obvious humiliation of the victims under Stalin and also under Hitler. So this person has not just been killed, we have humiliated him and his family and made it known as a deterrent. So reading these history books, which are basically for an audience that is willing to wade into the darkest chapters of human history, you understand it can repeat itself anywhere. It's just a question of, you will always find the people willing to do it. The Ordinary Man book makes it clear. Money, advancement, personal advantages, there's always people willing to do it. There are people who have the honor or the moral fortitude to say no to this shit, but they're few. There are much more people that can be corrupted. So would you like to die in the Finland front against fighting Soviet Red Army troops? Or would you like to have triple your salary and your wife gets a lot of benefits like an apartment of a Jewish family that is beautiful in Hamburg? But you have to go and shoot Jews. You will find people. So there's a few other books that you can read like that. But the two that stood out in my, let's say, 30 years of reading books that are difficult topics, The Whisperers, horrific. The Ordinary Man is nightmarish. There's chapters in there where they basically are like trying to outdo each other in how quickly they can shoot women and children. It's like,
which is not very different from stories we have heard from the occupied territories in Ukraine. Not just also like Izum and Bucha and places like that were occupied for a short time. Same exact thing. I mean, they're shooting women and children. They're doing terrible things. I mean, the Russians are terrible.
If you go back in Russian history, since 1820s, it was always like this. They come to a place, they first kill the elite, then they corrupt or bribe part of the population, be their servants, to also oppress the rest. If that doesn't work, they will deport or genocide whole people. And this is how the Russians expanded their empire. And people forget that the Russian colonial empire ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. There are still some colonies in the North Caucasus they retained, but the big colonies like Ukraine and Kazakhstan freed themselves finally. I mean, Poland was a colony of the Russian Empire until 1918. People forget that. Moldavia was always part of Romania. It's one of the 3 constituent principalities of the Romanian people. It was a colony of the Russians until after World War I, where Romania finally freed it. And then Stalin took it back and made it again a colony of the Russians. So Russia is the last colonial empire, and people forget that. And then it's like, oh, but there's Russians living there. Yes, there's Russians living there. But to understand how the Russians got there, you have to imagine the Brits went to India, and then they killed 20 million Indians and used the homes of those dead people to settle British people. And now the British are telling Indians, we can't leave because there's 20 million British people living in India. So the Brits never did that. The French never did that. The other colonial empires never did that. We can talk about the Spanish 15th, 16th century in South America. Okay. But the Russians did it. First thing, when the Russians invaded the Baltics in 1940 was deport the intellectuals, deport the educated, shoot the politicians, shoot the police officers, shoot the military officers. Lots of free flats after that, settle Russians. And now it's a Russian territory with a Estonian and Latvian minority. So that's the plan of Stalin. And if you want to advance in these Russian colonies, the only way to do it is to become Russian. Why do so many Ukrainians speak Russian? Or Belarus people speak Russian? Because under the Tsarist and Soviet systems, if you became Russian, Russified your name, dropped all attachments to the former people and nation, you could advance your career. If you try to retain your Ukrainian identity, in the worst case, they put you in the psychiatry because that is a sickness that can only be treated by electrocution and electroshocks. So most people have a complete misconception about what Russia is. Russia is a colonial empire. We just don't realize it because when the Russians went to colonize Siberia, they murdered everyone. So this wasn't Russia. This is Siberian peoples. They don't exist anymore because the Russians murdered them and settled Russians. And now it's like, it's Russia. It was always Russia. They're trying to do that now in southern Ukraine. The exactly same thing, take the children away, kill people, disappear people, settle Russians there. They try the same playbook every time.
Yeah, we're not going to, I don't think we're going to know how bad southern eastern Ukraine has been over the last 3 years. We won't know for decades what actually is happening. There are stories coming out, but we won't know the real truth for decades, probably, if we're lucky.
The archives of the Stalin purges and so on were opened in the 19th by Yeltsin. This British scholar went there to write his book, The Whisperers. When Putin came to power, he was like, let's seal those documents again immediately. Because, nobody should know how horrific the Russian genocides of other nations were. Like the Tartars in Crimea, the Circassians, it goes on and on. It goes back to the Tsar. The Tsar was like, Russia is a nation built on stolen history, stolen lands, and stolen names. Because Russia, that's a name stolen from Ukraine. The lands have been stolen from other peoples. And the history, they stole it from Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, and from Ukraine. So Russia per se is basically a young state and pretends to be old and big by stealing the history of others and the lands of others. So if we can cut Russia back to its original size, would be wonderful. Just the problem is they killed everybody else and settled Russians. Like, what can you do with Kaliningrad? All the Germans there were killed or sent packing. The Kuril Islands were Japanese. No Japanese there anymore, and the Russians just keep them. Viipuri was Finnish. There's no Finnish there anymore. It's just Russians there. So this Russians tradition of expansion by genocide and displacing other peoples and then claiming this was always Russian. no, it wasn't Russian until 1941. Then you occupied it and rid it the place of its native population. So Russia, I mean, I could go on for hours about the stolen history of, let's use the correct name for Russia from now, Muscovy, because there is no Russia. It's Muscovy, named after the Principality of Moscow, which was the only state. And yeah, so we could go on for hours about how Russia stole not just lands and history, also cultural they stole the culture of other nations to create their own culture and so on. So yeah.
Right. I think what people need to understand is at this point, Russia understands and Ukrainians understand that there is no going back for Ukraine. Russia is not going to be able to assimilate the average Ukrainian back into the Soviet Union after 4 years of just disgusting conduct in war by the Russians. So the Russians probably will have no choice but to implement very draconian measures to control and assimilate Ukrainian territories moving forward. That's what people need to understand is for the Ukrainians, there's no turning back. They've already crossed the Rubicon. They are all in. They cannot have Russian rule in Ukraine at any cost. Yeah. So to the point of they will die on that line because they have to, because they will be killed, or it will be so draconian, the re-education camps that Ukrainians will be put in. There's just no going back for them.
We can look at the history of Finland and of Poland, who were both occupied by the Russians, the Polish since 1780 something after the third partition. And the Poles had one uprising after another to try to rid themselves of the Russians. And the Finns were occupied, I think, after the Great Northern War, some 1720, 30. These nations were occupied and subjugated. And there were like persecutions of the people and the culture and the language and everything. Both of these nations, Finland and Poland, along with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, after World War I, during the Russian Civil War, managed to liberate themselves from the Russian occupation and oppression and so on. And the Poles were then betrayed by the Western powers after World War II, and the Russians occupied them again, mass murdering their way through Polish cities and villages to get rid of everyone who was not corruptible by the Russian new Soviet regime. And Finland was attacked by the Russians after the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1940. But the Finns managed to defend themselves because the Russians attacked in winter. And so the Finns managed to fight the Soviet Union to a standstill in the 1940-41 Winter War. So Poland is free now for 35 years, and every Polish person you meet hates the Russians. It's like an absolute, it's like in America, Americans like fries. Poles hate the Russians. It's the one common denominator of the entire nation of Poland. You go to Finland, every Finn is like, what's the best in life? Well, murdering Russians, killing Russians, shooting Russians, burning Russians, blowing up Russians. And it's such a hatred because all the nations around Russia have been occupied, oppressed, subjugated, and in some cases brutally massacred by the Russians. And the thing is, the Ukrainians managed for many time under the Tsarist regime and Soviet regime to not be that brutally oppressed until Stalin came with the Holodomor and killed millions of Ukrainians. So he could settle then Russians in Ukraine and have, it always has been Russians. Well, you killed all the Ukrainians and you settled Russians, and now you say it's always been Russians.
Those policies killed a lot of Russians as well, though. Just to note.
The thing is that...
yeah, go ahead.
Stalin didn't care who he killed. It just meant that he needs to kill people. It's kind of like, it's like, I don't care what you serve me for dinner, just serve me something. And Stalin was like, I don't care how many people you shoot. No, who you shoot. I just told you have to shoot 1,000 people in that city. It's like, you live in, I don't know, let's say you live in the United States in Chicago, and your local police officer gets the order from Stalin. So this city has 1 million inhabitants. I want you to shoot 20,000 people by next Tuesday. I don't care who. So Stalin, but it was much easier to kill minorities. So that's why the minorities got the brunt of the Stalin repression. People are like, oh, Stalin was so great.
Let's go back to the premise that former Soviet satellites, knowing what they know now, are very resistant. Isn't even strong enough of a word to Russian culture and influence. But let's take Moldova, for example. I find Moldova a very scary place. I don't like to travel in Chisinau. I'm very nervous there because the Russian influence is so strong. You never know who you're talking to. What explains Moldovans' 50-50 proposition right now, between Russian influence and Western European influence? I don't really understand why a former Soviet satellite that knows how bad it is under Russia would even entertain. Like, why is it so close in Moldova? What would you think?
One of the reasons is the moment a neighboring country really prospers, the people lose all interest in Russia. The thing you could understand that Ukraine started to split in the middle was around the time that the Western Ukrainians looked to Poland and saw every building renovated, all the roads fixed, the economy growing, the salaries growing, people everybody buying a car, while their country was still in a complete wreck from the Soviet times. And Western Ukrainians saw that life in Poland is 10 times better. And for them, there was an urge to move towards the European Union. Eastern Ukraine, especially Donbass, it's 1,000 miles to Poland. They looked to Russia and saw that life in Russia is 2 times better, 3 times better than in Ukraine. So if you look at the whole picture, Poland, life quality 10 times better than in Ukraine, and in Russia, 2-3 times better than in Ukraine. Where you want to go? To Poland. But the Eastern Ukrainians didn't really see that, or the Crimeans. And this way, basically, the Russians could influence them with saying life in Russia would be better for you. But most people understood that with living in Russia comes oppression. So when the Russians moved into those areas, the only ones that they found willing to support them was the mafia. All the leaders of Donbass at the beginning and in Crimea were the local mafia bosses, which were willingly taking the Russian given opportunity to become the rulers of these areas and plunder them. And in Moldova, it's dirt poor there. Romania for many, many years was completely the same in poverty. The last few years, Romania has gone way up in economy. It's like one of the most booming economies in Europe. And you can tell more and more people realized now that looking to Russia is like a losing proposition, because if you go to Russia, yes, your life will be twice as good as in Moldavia now, but at the price of brutal oppression. But on the other side, if you look at Romania, your life is already 8 to 9 times better if you go there. So the thing is that in these countries like Moldova, the young people left, and who remained are losers, people without discipline, without education, and old people. These people don't want to work. And in Russia, you can be an informer for the government and you don't have to work. You just get your money for your alcohol and vodka. And so Moldova is split because young people left, educated people left to seek opportunities in the West. And what remained, lots of these people don't want capitalism. They want the cushy world of Soviet communism where you don't have to do anything. This is not happening in Russia, but the Russian government will give you opportunities to basically not work and just be a informer for the government and such things. So it's really difficult in Moldova. But one thing that in Moldova we always have to keep in mind is Moldova was for centuries part of Romanian culture. It was one of the Wallachia, Moldova, Transylvania, the three principalities of Romania. That's more Romania. And for centuries, Wallachia, I think it's English, is Wallachia in Moldova, were vassals of the Ottoman Empire, while Transylvania went between Hungary, then Austria-Hungary, and back and forth. Post-World War I, the Romanians were on the winning side, and for the first time, all of Romanians were unified in one nation. Transylvania, Wallachia, Moldova. And then Lenin took a part of Ukraine and created the Moldovan Socialist Soviet Republic. So he could claim the rest of Moldova for Soviet Union. Parts that Lenin created this Moldovan SSSR from were never part of the Romanian culture. It was a Ukrainian settled Ukrainian people's land. And then he settled Russians there. And in 1940, with the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Soviet Union invaded Romania, annexed Moldova, and reunited it with the Moldovan Socialist Soviet Republic, which had never existed, was just a fantasy product. And the moment they reunited, the Soviets then cut off most of this Soviet Socialist Republic Moldova and gave it back to Ukraine because they don't need it anymore. Immediately began deportations of Moldovians, executions of Moldovians, and they said, you know what? You speak Romanian. You write Romanian. And from now on, you will write your language in Cyrillic letters like good Russians. And we will try to change your language so we separate you as a new people from your actual nation, which is Romania. And then the Russians basically settled 300,000 Russians in Transnistria to basically have, again, a minority in the country which can control the country. And post-Soviet Union, civil war, Moldova is basically split, part splits off, and the whole country remains dirt poor because the Russians know if you keep them dirt poor, almost starving, they're not moving west. They depended on us for the gas and food and so on help. And the best thing we can do in Moldova is help them economically, because most of these people that desire the return of the Soviet Union or go to Russia are old or alcoholics. They will die. It's just a question of time. Economically helping Moldova is excellent. Actually reuniting Moldova with its two other brethren, Wallachia and Transylvania, to return Romania to its former state would be the best thing, because then Moldova goes from dirt poor to poorest part of the European Union and gets swamped with money, which means basically that they swim in money. And
right.
Yeah,
it would be like the German unification in the
even
early
better,
90s.
because there's much less Moldovan and then East German, and the European Union is much richer than Germany back then. So the thing is, if you go to Poland, old towns, every building is renovated. And on 90% of the buildings is a small little plaque that says renovated with European Union funds. The Ukrainians dream of that. The Moldovans dream of that. This European Union that the richer countries sent over money to lift everyone out of poverty. Just dumb people and people without education don't understand it. So let's go back to Ukraine, Donbass and Crimea. If you watched in 2014, who came out to support the Russian takeover? Very old people, very uneducated people, and then lots of people who came there with a bottle of vodka in their hand and was like, I support Putin. I mean, it's the same in Belarus. If you look, the old people are like, oh, the Soviet Union was so good, and the young people are all running away because...
Yeah, there are some reflections in Ukraine too, similar to that, because under the Soviet Union, the villages were, more taken care of, I guess, relative to the cities in modern day Ukraine. So a lot of the villagers, a lot of from the old country, I guess, in Ukraine, they have more fond memories of the Soviet Union, I guess, because the villages, there was a less capitalist, more egalitarian kind of perspective on, funding. I'm not an expert in this, but funding the villages versus the city growth that we see in, any modern society. Cities grow. That's where capitalism thrives.
The thing is, the moment a country joins the European Union agriculture funds are so insane. Suddenly, the farmers are swimming in money. It's like, should I buy a tractor or build myself a swimming pool for my pigs? It's like absolute insanity. So, if you look at Polish farmers, it's like, Polish farmer is like, we fly to Bali for the Christmas holiday, and the Ukrainian farmer is like, can I put food on the table for Christmas? So, if people who understand these relations at the European Union, one of the main focus is to lift everybody in Europe out of poverty. The Ukrainians who have a little bit of education and traveled to the West have realized that. As have all the young Belarus people who really, the Russian minority in the Baltic states, the old ones refuse to speak the Baltic languages. They want to back to Russia. They admire Putin. And the young ones look at their life inside the European Union and the life of young people in Russia and are like, holy hell, let's learn Estonian. And complete different. The good thing about this is that the people that love the Soviet Union most are 70, 80, and the life expectancy is like 72, and they're gone. So, not wishing anyone death. It's just a natural course, And the age that Putin is now, 73, that's the age of the people that reminiscence most fondly about the Soviet Union. So worst case scenario, in 10 years, we have rid ourselves of them. We just need to get 10 more years. And in Ukraine, what was interesting when I was there, because I lived there from 2009 to 2016, the people who hated the Russians most after the Crimean takeover and the Donbass war started in 2014 were the people who had loved Russia most. They felt so betrayed and they felt so threatened. And in Zaporozhye, which is a city where it's like 99.8% Russian speakers, the hate was palpable. It was like, yes, I speak Russian, but I use this language to curse the Russians. There were like people asked, so the Russians have reached Donbass, Luhansk. What will happen if they come to Zaporozhye? And the people were like, well, my husband will shoot them. I will hand him the ammunition and we will yell at them to come at us in Russian because then maybe they think we are friends and they come out and we can shoot them easier. So the hate in the Ukrainian East, incredible. The Western Ukrainians always hated the Russians. Basic principle. It's like occupation, oppression. And in Eastern Ukraine, the Russian dominance was longer and more Russians have settled. So there was intermingling, lots of Russian and Ukrainian marriages and so on. But you could tell absolute in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is basically 30 kilometers from the Russian border, and it's like a 100% Russian-speaking city. You would have looked 10 years ago, you would have had trouble find one Ukrainian speaker now. Now half the city is like, I don't speak Russian. I don't know that language. I don't speak Siberian monkey. So it's, it's healthy. It's healthy for Ukrainians. The Ukrainians finally, when I told Ukrainians in 2009, Russia isn't a friend. Russia sees you as a little colony they can push around. Ukrainians were incensed. How can you say that about the Russians? They're our friend. We are brothers. You will find no Ukrainian anymore who thinks of Russia in a positive light. Pure hatred.
What are your reflections? You look back on the Maidan. What are your reflections on that, and how did that strife contribute to the defense of Ukraine in 2022? So they went through this arduous process of liberation. How did that contribute to their defense in 2022?
The Ukrainian history is post-fall of the Soviet Union, like in Russia, the mafia guys robbed everything and everybody was poor. Horrific time in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians made a revolution in 2005 already, the Orange Revolution, to try to better their fate. And they put reformers in government who did zero to fight the corruption. Mm-hmm. In 2010, the pro-Russian most corrupt cliques and gangs came back to power because so many people just didn't go to vote, just fed up with the incompetence of the reformers they had put into power in 2005 through the Orange Revolution. And in the Orange Revolution, Ukraine was divided half and half between the blue and the orange camp. So the blue was the Russian camp and the orange was the Western camp. It was half and half. After 2010, when these pro-Russians came back in power, they plundered the country in unimaginable ways. Like, there's absolutely nobody in the West can understand how horrifically they plundered that country. Like, I could give you examples that I give you one example. The government decided all medicine has to be bought by one centralized company of the government. And it was like, okay, we buy the medicine. So government paid a company to buy, let's say, 1 million doses of a medicine. And the company then bought just 10,000 and pocketed the rest. The 10,000 arrived. They gave money to some of the government officials who then signed off. Yeah, well, everything, the whole million of doses is here. Then they didn't distribute the medicine. They told the hospitals, you don't get because other hospitals get it. And the 10,000 doses disappeared into pharmacies. And then the doctors were like, well, you need this medicine, but we didn't get any, even though the government buys it centralized to make it cheaper. You have to go and buy it in the pharmacy. Who owned the pharmacy? Of course, the health minister. And they jacked up the prices. So you get this in Europe for 10 euros, and in Ukraine it's 80. And I worked there, and there was continuously collections of people in the company, 600 people going around with like, we're collecting money today because this person's brother is sick, needs this medicine, and the family can't pay for it. So the whole country was plundered. And the hope of the Ukrainians was that with the European Association Agreement in 2013 that Yanukovych, the then president, promised to sign, at least some of their corruption will be put in check because the European Union will not allow certain absolute obscene corruption schemes. And then Yanukovych was like, you know what? I can ask Putin if he gives me some money if I don't sign it. And Putin was like, sure, here's the money. You don't have to sign it. And so protests erupted in Kyiv against not signing an association agreement with the European Union, which was just easier travel and some standards in anti-corruption legislation and export-import. So it's not really huge. It was just like an economic agreement with some free travel for the Ukrainians. And Yanukovych immediately sent the police to beat these students up, which triggered a revolution. And the revolution, I was there, had no anti-Russian connotations at the beginning. And then Putin was like, Yanukovych, you get $3 billion for your government, whatever you want to do, if you use the military to get rid of these demonstrators. So that moment, Ukraine erupted in an anti-Russian revolution. The good thing was that Yanukovych was a chicken. He really couldn't bring himself to send in the military, also knowing that vast numbers of troops would refuse. And in the end, he fled. Because at some point he was like, okay, let's try violence, and it didn't work, and he fled. And Putin took it as a personal insult to him, because his regime is built on corruption and bribes and buying people off. It's like in Russia, it's like You can either be bought off by the regime and become rich, or you will be killed in horrific ways that humiliate you and make a mockery of your life and your loved ones. And Putin took it as an insult. And then, because obviously people have no agency, because this is the old KGB playbook, only the revolutionaries like Lenin and Stalin and Putin have agency. Everybody else is a sheep. The Ukrainians are not sheep. What the people in power forget, thanks to the internet, you don't need revolutionaries for life who organize a demonstration, a protest, a revolution. You just need a mobile phone and a WhatsApp group. You can organize a revolution. You don't need any longer Lenin's elite revolutionaries who come in and organize the revolution because the sheep can't do it on themselves. And so the war started. I remember I wrote an article 2 days before the shooting on Maidan that if Ukraine succeeds in this war revolution, Putin will invade Crimea and start a civil war in Donbass. And everyone was like, nah, he's not going to do it. 2 weeks later, he did it. So it was so obvious from how Putin was talking what he was going to do. And the moment that Putin invaded Ukraine, first thing that happened, there was a national consensus now that Russia is no longer our friend. We are under threat. All we wanted was to preserve our freedom and an end to corruption. And that was already too much for Putin to accept, because he wants us as a colony to exploit, our elites to corrupt, and he doesn't want us to have our own freedoms, like freedom of speech, freedom of culture, freedom of language, freedom of like Ukrainian theater. It was forbidden under the Soviet Union, under the Tsar. You couldn't go to a Ukrainian language theater because that was already considered subversive, treacherous. The Ukrainians then went to war against the Russians with barely any army. And most of these people, it's volunteers that went, died. It was just so few when the Russian army came in and killed scores of them. But all of Ukraine suffered, killed, and maimed. And the nation began to really create a myth of we are Ukrainians and we have to fight the Russians. So the mentality began to change from Russia is our brotherly nation to Russia is our deadly enemy. And for the next 10 years, scores of Ukrainian men rotated through the front in Donbass, volunteers, soldiers that were drafted, like continuously, hundreds of thousands of men. They all got combat experience. They all came back hating the Russians. Their wives hated the Russians. Their children hated the Russians. And at one point, I understood that the Ukrainians have completely gone away from this Russian brotherly nation shit. And there was a Ukrainian marine company or battalion that had to cross from Donbass into Russia to avoid being annihilated by a Russian paratroopers battalion or regiment. The Russians disarmed them and let them cross further north back into Ukraine. So these men had just been to Russia, been disarmed, and the Russians told them to go back, promise you will not fight the Russians again because we are brothers and so on. And I remember this company, basically this battalion, arrived back in Mykolaiv. It's a Russian city. It was completely built by Russians. Everybody speaks Russian. They arrived outside their military base. There was thousands of people singing Ukrainian anthem, praising them, applauding them. The guys went in, rearmed, and went back to the front. So basically, they spent an hour at home and then went back to kill Russians. And at that point, I understood two things. Russia has lost this nation, and they will never, never again be subjugated to the Russian rule. Because if these people who speak Russian, who just barely escaped a Russian having killed them, and the Russians basically let them live, they not even going to their families, they just come, get the new weapons, and go back to the front in a city like Mykolaiv. And at that point, I understood that the Ukrainians will fight, all of them. And that was in summer 2014, like in August or July 2014. It was like a moment you understood that this country is now united around the idea we have to fight the Russians. Most important, probably, error that Putin made is to invade Donbass and start a war, because that was when the Ukrainians realized there's no going back. And when Putin invaded in 2022 in February, like 500,000 to 1 million Ukrainians took up arms, and 90% of them had combat experience from the war, while the Russians were just a parade army who has come in and drove down main roads like, yay, we are going on like on a parade. They brought uniforms for the victory parade in Kyiv. They already stamped the medals that Putin would hand out in Kyiv. They had lists of the people they would hang in public squares. And then they got all killed. Like in the first week, the Ukrainians killed 10 to 20,000 Russians. Like excellent numbers, like top-notch numbers.
Surprise. Right.
Yeah. And then the Russian military, because they were so incensed, went around to murder civilians left and right, because obviously they couldn't imagine that these cockholes, they have a racist view of the Ukrainians. One, how dare they fight back? Two, how dare they fight back and kill us? And three, how dare they make us look bad? Oh, there's an old lady riding on a bike down the road. Let's shoot her because that's our revenge. Very Russian, very Russian. That's have always been like this. If you can't win it, we go after the civilian population.
Right. Yeah. Terrible, terrible people.
Sorry if I speak long.
No, this is great. If you were, you're a filmmaker, documentarian. If you were to do a documentary or a film on the full-scale invasion, what would you focus on?
Probably the Russians had this wonderful idea. I mean, it's on paper. We will be greeted as liberators, so our logistic convoys can just drive 300 kilometers from Sumy to Kyiv to resupply our units who have taken the city in 2 days. All those convoys coming in from the east on these 300 kilometers, 200 miles something drive from the east to Kyiv, none of them made it. Every village basically was like, I have a gun, I hunt deers. Let's go shoot Russians. There's images of guys, basically the farmer is like, well, I was milking the cows, then the Russians came, so we went out and killed everybody in a convoy, burned it down, and now we have Kalashnikovs and not just deer hunting rifles. And it was basically every single Russian convoy went through there, and the Russians didn't even give them maps. It was like, the people will tell you where to go. Just stop in a village and say, hello, and the Russians got shot in the face immediately.
Yeah.
And that is Eastern Ukraine, is supposedly the Russian-friendly area. And the villagers put up the fences, and basically some villagers was like, well, we got a tank now. How did you do that? Well, the Russians came through, and one of their tanks ran out of fuel. So they abandoned it. And basically, this guy is 60, but 40 years ago, he was a soldier in the Soviet army. It's the same tank. So he drove it. We put it in a barn and waited for the Russians to return. And when they returned, we opened fire through the barn windows, and we destroyed 2 Russian tanks, killed a bunch of Russians. And now we have more tanks and a BMP infantry fighting vehicle. We're waiting for the next Russians. So those villagers absolutely butchered thousands of Russians, logistic troops. And one of my favorite things is one logistic convoy of the Russians got lost. So they found a city and went to the city police station. We're like asking the police officers, guys, how do we get to Kyiv? We have the fuel for the Russian army, for the tanks. And the police officers, they're like, just sit down in the courtyard. We're going to figure out. Russians came, sat down in the courtyard and got shot. And obviously the fuel never made it to Kyiv. So, if I would make a movie, there's a few topics that have captured the imagination of the world, like the fight for Hostomel Airport, where the Ukrainians really, like, what you do not do in a war is land a force isolated in hostile territory on an airbase with no chance of resupply. And the Russians did it and got pretty badly beat up. The Russians then managed to arrived there with a convoy coming in from Belarus and saved their people, but the whole operation was a disaster. So that is something that people remember and that people know. But the real story was that how the Russian logistics just never made it past the forests of eastern Ukraine. And this road goes from Russia to Chernihiv and then through Kyiv. And it's a wide road, and we will just get our resupplies through this road. Chernihiv didn't surrender. They had a volunteer militia and one tank battalion, and the Russians found out that we cannot get through Chernihiv. If we try to go around, we're going to ambush, and the whole city never fell. The Russians began to bombard the city with cluster munitions and killed thousands of people in the city, just tried to flatten the city, as they always do when they don't get their way. They just massacre civilians. But in these little towns and villages, it was like, yeah, what you doing for this afternoon? Well, I'm going to get the hunting rifle and go down to the road and let's see if there's some Russians pass by to kill them. Mm-hmm. For 3 months, basically 2 months, the whole east of Ukraine was, and there are stories that when Ukraine came to these areas after the Russians retreated back to Russia, it was like farmers, I have 2 BMPs and a Panzer air defense system in my barn, and my neighbor has a tank, and we have behind the house, there's a stack of 60 dead Russians that stink. So we burned them, but it's still, stinky. And so some small village like that who just is like, what do we do this afternoon? Fishing or killing Russians? First the pleasure, then the fishing. And
that's great.
Yeah. But I know some of these villages, and it was like absolute mayhem for the Russians out there, because the Russians didn't send any combat units with them, just their logistics units. And it was like, look, there's an engineering unit with some bridging materials and some Kalashnikovs. So, I would go for that because Russia lost this war because they couldn't get any logistics to the front, except from the north to Belarus, because that's a short distance. Chernobyl is emptied of people, so they could drive through there without the fear of ambushes. And everywhere else from the east, it's like, yeah,
that's pretty close to the story of Red Dawn. We had a movie that they made in the 80s where the Russians invade, and the villagers, the American villagers, basically
the Wolverines
bound together. The Wolverines, that's right. Yeah, so you could basically make Red Dawn.
Yeah, But in Red Dawn, the Russians were competent, completely fictional.
That's true. Yeah.
One thing that people always keep telling me, the Russians defeated the Germans in World War II. No, the United States defeated the Germans in World War II. Because the Russians went to the front in American boots, with American trucks, with American logistics, with American fuel, with American food, with American ammunition, and in large parts with American tanks and fighter jets. And then used them so imbecilic, the Soviets lost 13 million soldiers. And the United States came in and was like, okay. I mean, the Soviets, yes, they killed a lot of Germans thanks to American logistics support. Could the Soviets have defeated the Germans on their own? No. Because if you look at the Soviet losses in manpower, killed and missing in action, and POW, in 41, extremely high. In 42, it goes down. 43, it goes down. And in 45, it goes up again. So this is the manpower losses of the Soviets. Goes down, and in 45, up. And now let's look at American Lend-Lease. 41, nothing. 42, it goes up. 43, it goes more up. The more American Lend-Lease logistic support came in, the less troops the Russian lost. And in 45, the Americans cut it back, understanding that Stalin isn't really our friend. And immediately, when American logistic support began to slow, Soviet losses went up again. So, yes, the Soviet had a high price in blood. due to their incompetence. But victory in World War II was the American worker, the American soldier, the American airman, the American Marine. The Brits played a role too, but if you then look at the map of divisions in Europe, it's like a few British divisions, 3 Canadian divisions, 2 French, Polish, and then like 60 Americans in the middle. So Putin tries to always tell the people, you have to be thankful to us because we defeated the Germans. And it's like, only because the United States helped you.
Well, I am not going to disagree with you on that front. You know, it's like the cliche that amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics. So it still holds, and the Russians are still a terrible army. So, Thomas, thank you for your time. This has been very enlightening. It's always nice to talk to you and get your perspective on history. Wish we could talk next time. We'll talk more contemporary issues, maybe. But this has been wonderful. Thank you.
The thing is that thank you for having me. And sorry if I talk about history too much, but
no, it's great.
Once someone told me you don't know something about Ukraine history, Russian history, then I'm like, okay, let's go read in. The thing is that I don't stop. I read into this topic so much that Armenia-Azerbaijan war, Armenian told me, you know nothing about us. I read into it, and then he came back, was like, you know more than us Armenians, so okay. So when you'd ask me about history of certain countries on the periphery of Russia, I know too much for an hour or 2 hours of discourse. Don't ask me about Italian military history, because I'm going to tell you 17 hours of just one regiment's history to bore you to death, because that's my expertise. So next time, contemporary topics, because the war is going on. The war will continue. The Chinese are trying to keep the Russians in the war because it helps them distract Europe and suck out American weapons that cannot be used against China in the Pacific. So the war will continue. The Ukrainians are in better shape than before. They're not in excellent shape. Lack of infantry. People that think that infantry is irrelevant. No, it's very relevant, like artillery, like air power. So we can talk hours about that too next time. But let's keep it for today at this, because I think it's now almost an hour, and I don't want to put your American audience to sleep with Ukrainian details.
It's been awesome. We have a little bit of a Italian audience too. So, I always joke that they're our biggest European audience. But thank you, Thomas. This has been great. I appreciate it.
If you want, we can make a special just for your Italian audience, and then.
Okay. We'll do a special edition just in Italian, and I'll just nod and smile. And
no, we do it in English, but then I will basically we will go into details like why Italian military bases serve 2 dishes per lunch, and all is always pasta, and so we can go into so many details here. Because I served in the Italian military, and basically I wrote every article on the Italian military on Wikipedia, and it's like 300 regimental histories by now of like 20 pages per regiment. So. Someone has some hobby.
Sounds enthralling. We'll talk about all of them. Okay, Thomas. Great to talk to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. See you soon.
The Flash Traffic Podcast.